Chapter 11. Prudence glanced at his automatons. Wasn't sure she wanted to have this discussion around a couple of machines who couldn't forget what they heard. "Let's check the lamps," she suggested, gesturing to the stairs. It was not her first choice of a place for a chat, based solely on heat and stench. All that glass too. But if they went down, they would run into his other machine. He hesitated, then nodded. She felt oddly conscious of him following her up to the lamp room. Its Fresnel lamp was a thing of beauty, the numerous facets of its glass reflecting and beaming the light out into the night for the ships that might be passing. An engineering marvel, even in her time. The light in the night in this one. She sighed and put it at her back. Her fingers danced on the buttons of her right arm instrument panel, activating the sound dampening field. It might be detected by whatever was out there, but that seemed a better option than getting overheard. Ernest grabbed her arm. "What did you do?" He touched it, but of course it did nothing. "It creates a sound dampening field, so that no one can overhear our conversation." The scientist warred with man in his expression. "How is that possible?" She studied him, wondering how much truth he could handle. "Do you have that feeling that we've talked like this before?" she asked, stalling for time for guidance. He shook his head. "I did down there, but it went away." "Okay, that was interesting. When did it go away?" He hesitated, then met her gaze with a directness that startled her. "When I started to believe you." She felt her jaw sag and snapped it up. "Oh. Well, that's good." Amazing was what she almost said. He'd come further than she'd thought possible. And in a shorter time. The key was the déjà vu, she decided. If they were in some kind of dimensional time correction, then maybe they'd change something. But they could still mess up. What was the right move? Right moves? And what would happen if they fixed things? Would this Ernest cease to exist? That was an awful thought. She liked this Ernest better than the others. Like the kiss. Would she forget again? That was sad too. "What's wrong?" he asked. Everything, she wanted to say. She didn't. "I'm trying to figure out how to explain." "The impossible?" He smiled a bit wryly as he said it. "The wildly impossible." He appeared to think about this, then said slowly, "I think I can take the wildly impossible as long as it is the truth." She looked at him. He'd know now. She didn't know why or how, but he'd know if she lied to him. Okay. The truth then. Chances were, neither of them was going to survive anyway. And if they didn't, would they have to do this again? How many times had they done it? The truth then. His gaze had a new steadiness, a new way of seeing her. "Who are you?" She met his gaze, took a breath and said, "I'm Prudence Pinkerton, an interdimensional scientist, sent here to stop this storm from eating all of time and everyone in time. For all time." They weren't sure about that, but that's where it seemed to be heading. He blinked once. Then again. And yet again. The silence grew, but oddly enough Prudence didn't feel awkward. It was a lot to take in. She respected the time he took, considering it all. He took a deep breath and blinked once more. Interdimensional? There will be this scientist in a few years who will postulate the theory that we exist in a multitude of dimensions, each one playing out a multitude of choices. A person goes left instead of right, and a new dimension forms because they made a different choice. Met someone. Didn't meet someone. Instead of the change rippling forward through that time, a new timeline spins off, leaving the, for want of a better word, the original timeline intact and unchanged. For most people, it will remain a theory. She paused, but he didn't speak. He didn't even blink. For me, for my family? It's not a theory, it's our reality. We, most of us, have the ability to travel through dimensions and through time. We don't know why or how this happened. We're not even sure when it first manifested. All we know is that it doesn't activate until puberty." He looked unconvinced. She made a face. "My family used to call it the gift. When we realized it wasn't always one, someone changed it to the talent." She shrugged. "If you think about it, one person is born with a talent for music, another for art, and someone else for inventing. No one thinks that's odd." She flashed him a smile. "It's not very comfortable having any talent, is it?" That hit home and he nodded. "No, it's not." He looked around. "So this is just another dimension to you?" "No." She shook her head. "This is different." She stared straight into his eyes. "You're different in this one. And the storm, it's different too." She hesitated again, but in for a penny. Dr. Masterson postulated the existence of closed dimensions. Changes that don't spawn new dimensions. One where the changes do ripple forward and change the future. This might be one. She stopped because she was moving into new territory. And he had a lot to take in. "Masterson?" He swallowed. "He is a dimensional traveler too." "Well, yes and no. He doesn't have the talent, but he's super smart, so he sometimes travels with one of us." How strange. She'd never wondered when and how he came on board before. He was just there, like her dad. "How am I different in this dimension?" he asked. He was pale, but that could be the bright light. Maybe. Oh crap. She closed her eyes for a minute, then opened them. Ophelia. Her dying is different. In all the others, she doesn't. You're married to her. Or jacketed, about to get married to her. His eyes widened. He looked like he might speak, but his lips thinned instead. He walked away from her, his shoulders twitching, then he turned back. "And the storm? How is it different here?" "It seems to be less damaging," she admitted. But she stopped because this wasn't just a wander into the unknown, this was a leap. "But?" His gaze demanded that she continue. "Your memory of me, of meeting me. That's really new. I've never ever had that happen." "But you have a theory?" "Well, I'm not sure it's a theory yet. More of a speculation, actually. But the fact that you remember something I don't, I wonder if time is replaying or resetting." He started to shake his head but paused. "Resetting. As if we got it wrong and must make it right." She nodded, her turn to be bemused. "Is that what you feel when the memories happen?" His turn to nod. "It is." "So if we got it wrong before, how do we get it right?" he finished. Ernest paced back and forth for what seemed like a long time. Finally, he turned to her. "If the meteorite in the Blizzableiter 3000 is somehow the issue, then I should disassemble the machine." Prudence started to nod but hesitated. "Does that feel right?" It was his turn to pause and consider. His shoulders lifted some. "It feels new." "Okay, well at least new is different from wrong." "But it is not known to be right." He rubbed his face impatiently. He should be used to uncertainty. He was a scientist, a weather scientist. And she really shouldn't have to point out this obvious, but he had taken a few hits in the last minute. If we've been getting it wrong, then we don't know what's right. All we've got to go on is new. He stared at her and finally nodded. "You are right." He blinked at that. "It's ironic, isn't it?" She grinned and he grinned back, though it was one with lots of strain in it. Wow, 3 in a row. They were on a roll. They started toward the stairs, but Prudence paused to ask, "Lord Henry? Is he new or wrong?" Ernest stopped, considering. "I only started to have the sensations when we were walking. I do not think, I cannot say." "Fair enough." She headed down, her booted feet ringing on the metal steps as she circled down to the watchroom. Ernest went to his Blizzblighter 3000, where had he come up with that name, and crouched down. He reached for the wires and stopped. "I did this before." "So wrong move," Prudence said, sort of asking but not really. She rubbed her face. A lot of interdimensional study involved feeling one's way in the dark, but this certainly had a new, high level of difficulty. "It's not very big, maybe we can, I don't know, I hide it." She looked around. There really wasn't a place that a determined search wouldn't reveal. But there were some nooks and crannies around that could buy them some time. Maybe. Ernest knelt, not talking, his expression intent. Finally he murmured, something about the lamp. The Fresnel lamp? It was designed to amplify light, not electricity, but okay. Where do we put it? His head tilted to one side, his glance moving from her to the automatons, then finally back to her. His gaze holding hers, he said, "No?" He glanced around. "I'll take Winston and Fred with me." She nodded, not sure she agreed with him. She angled her Regent Etter 5 casually, but in a direction where it would be easy to target Niles if he made a move. She flipped it to energy charge. She'd seen how fast he could move. She'd get one shot at him. Problem was, it took multiple bullets to take out an automaton. She had to hope a surge would short out his circuits. She shifted from one foot to the other, wondering why she felt restless and uneasy. Well beyond the weird storm and dragons. Metal hit metal above her. She didn't like not seeing what was going on up there. She didn't have Ernest's other sense, so this wrong feeling was probably just about being scared to her toenails. She wanted to look up, even though she couldn't see anything. So she looked down instead. Winston was a dim figure on the last half landing. After that point, the stairs made a complete circuit of the lighthouse before reaching the next landing. He didn't seem to be moving, but she thought she saw the slight glow of his eyes. That was a bit creepy. Her dimension hadn't really gone heavy into automatons when the difference engine was discovered. And it was too easy to mess with their programming, so they weren't used at all inside the agency. There was no question the ability to travel through dimensions had accelerated the development of other technology available to the agency, but it was all very carefully controlled. No one wanted to be the CEO who created a catastrophic paradox. She shifted again as things grew quieter up top. She wasn't sure she trusted any of the automatons. All 4 automatons had been out of Ernest's sight at some point, but only the 2 ship handlers had been outside the umbrella of light. The storm had appeared during the day, so it wasn't the light that kept it at bay. Was there something about lighthouse lamps? The light they generated that was protecting them? Or was the light an illusion of safety? She realized even the small sounds had stopped up in the lamp room. What if the automatons had done something to Ernest? There was the clump as first one, then the other descended. But not Ernest. "Ernest. Are you all right?" She raised her voice to be heard over the footsteps. "I'll be right down." His voice sounded fine, a little breathless. The automatons looked the same. Prudence found a niggle of doubt working its way into her certainty that this Ernest was as good and trustworthy as the others. The memory of her missing grandfather surfaced. As far as she knew, they were the 2 with the strongest talent ever recorded in agency history. And he was missing. What if the trap was not for Ernest but for her? If someone had been studying her while she studied the Ernests, how hard would it have been to detect her lack of distance? The impersonal she'd not been quite able to maintain? All this Ernest had to do was pretend. What had he actually told her? She hadn't told him about Octavius, but if someone had captured her grandfather, they might already know the importance of a familiar. She could transit without him, but without him she could not transit home. She checked her tracking. So far Octavius seemed okay. As long as her connection was strong enough, they should be able to leave. It was not at the maximum range, but it was close. It was tempting, so tempting the portal started to form in front of her again. But what if that was the desired outcome? What if whatever was out there hoped she'd panic and leave? Or if this trap was for her, they'd want her to have the illusion she could leave. The boom of the door far below made her jump. If she hadn't been in a lighthouse, she might have hit the roof. But she couldn't jump that high. Close but not quite. The adrenaline surge almost sent her into a new dimension, though. Dr. Warren? In cultured accents, Lord Henry's voice echoed up the tower, his voice bouncing eerily off the thick stone walls. She was not in the mood for him. Was it morning in the time flux they seemed to be in? It was still dark outside, but that did not mean sunrise wasn't happening. And she had told him he could come back. A soft shuffle came from behind her. She turned. It was Ernest padding carefully and quietly down to her level. His gaze was filled with warning. She got it, but also felt caught between two unknowns, so instead of meeting his gaze directly, she peeked down. The door was open, letting in some light, though she could not identify its source. It could be the sun or light from the lamp. His dark figure filled the opening, laying a distorted shadow onto the rough floor. He had to have checked the house first. If he'd parked next to the weatherman, then he knew they weren't there. Dr. Warren? Miss Smith? Some worry filtered into the suave voice now. Ernest half shrugged and leaned over the railing. We are up here, sir. He hesitated, then added, It is a considerable climb. It was. It gave them a few minutes' grace, depending on how fit he was. Prudence hesitated. I'm going to go look out again. And possibly have a look around the lamp room? Ernest did not look pleased, but he nodded. Keep that close. He indicated her Regent Etter 5. Always. Her smile was a little easier, though she could not say exactly why. He looked at her suddenly. It was you. It was me, what? The name. Blizzblighter 3000. He half smiled. It was you. Her smile widened. I hate to admit it, but it does sound like something I'd come up with. Both the Pinkerton Etter 20 and the Regent Etter 5 were unofficial names that had somehow managed to filter through the ranks of the agency. For some reason, knowing this helped. Her breath seemed to come easier, though doubts tried to peck at this sprout of hope. I won't be long. She started up. The doubts lingered, but with less force. Maybe she'd rather believe than not. Besides, if this was a trap, well, the fly never escaped by struggling. Up top, Prudence, with her goggles on the active setting, walked all the way around the lamp room. No readings from the lamp, but her gaze tracked up. There. She blinked and pulled off the goggles. Then lowered them again and turned them to magnify. Slower this time, she pulled them down. Without the goggles, his mineral was almost invisible, tucked up there. It looked like the wires from his Blizzblighter 3000 now lead up and out the vents to the lightning rod on the top of the lighthouse. Had he been following his instincts when he put the Blizzblighter 3000 up there, or let his scientist out, hoping to test his device while hiding it in sort of plain sight? She sighed. It might be brilliant. Or not brilliant. Heat and tired sapped at her strength and muddied her thinking. Not that thinking would help that much, since she didn't know much anyway. She clambered out the door, hoping she could pretend it was cooler outside. It was a little better. At least the fuel smell was less. She leaned back, remembering her first transit without a trainer. Just she and Octavius making a leap into the void. She'd had a target and she'd nailed it. But she'd never forget the first time alone in the space between, wondering where and when they'd land. If they did. They had equipment, but the most essential calculation could only happen in her head. In the mind. Before her talent manifested, she'd asked Lewis how it happened. He'd shrugged. You just feel it. There are lines leading all over, and you pick one and follow it. But how do you know it's the right line? You just do. He'd ruffled her hair. They won't let you and your familiar go solo until you know. It took skill and training to stick the line. There were so many. So easy to run off course. No one knew why a familiar helped center the mind. There were some theories about animal instincts and such. In the end, it didn't matter. It was a two-part process. First came the talent, then the familiar found the talent. If the familiar didn't come, well, there were those who tried anyway. Eventually they were found, sometimes alive, sometimes in a grave. It was a time thing, not just a dimension thing. If this was what it felt like to lose the line, well, she did not want to go there. And if she was already there, well, better not to think about it. She straightened her spine, then her body, positioned her goggles, and set them to scan again. She made a circuit around the balcony. The light was warm and comforting. Even in her time, lighthouses were special. Was that what had drawn her here? She did one more round, taking it slower and trying to see everything. Maybe the readings would be found, even if... As far as she could tell, the dragons were gone or flying somewhere else. On the pier side, there was the shadow of an airship tied down on the opposite side of the pier from the weatherman. Lord Henry's ride, she presumed. The night outside the lamp umbrella seemed less dark than earlier. She reached the door again, glanced around, suddenly uneasy in a new way. Amazing, she had a new way to be uneasy. She thought she'd reached her upper limit. My head hurts, she told the night. Her heart felt a bit battered too. And the sad part? She was the one who'd given it the swift kick. Ernest hadn't done anything. Yet. She sighed, reluctant to go down and face either man. She closed her eyes, rubbed her face. The waft of cool air felt so good, she sighed with relief this time. Cool turned downright cold against her sweaty skin. How could it be cold? Uneasy ramped up to bad feeling. She needed to lift her lids, but man, she didn't want to. And she wished she'd kept them closed, when the prow of an airship emerged from the darkness just ahead of her. It wasn't the fact that it was airborne, or even that it was an airship that she found so, well, terrifying. It was the semi-transparent hull, with small pulses of light running along the beams. And the eyes. Thousands of them. Glowing red. Yeah, those were terrifying too. You've been listening to Specters in the Storm by Pauline Baird Jones. Copyright by Pauline Baird Jones. All rights reserved.